Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'd have to think about that some or get into conversation with others who do have some thoughts, which I'm very interested in hearing.
Mm-hmm. And if we want to, we can put that on the back burner and certainly return to it later.
You know, if there were to be any contact with Native Americans, I think we need to check out if their theology corresponds with the bishops, because they could be like, Christians are all in different places. Well, maybe some of these tribes are too, insofar as I think just out of a matter of respect, we need to see where they are and so make sure that we harmonize with them or they with us.
Yeah, that would, I think, definitely be true if we talked about having an event with a, Native American sovereign nation that came. And that certainly is a really interesting idea. I also think there's an opportunity to think through, again, like, are there quotes or phrases that we might find compelling to display on the grounds here? Or is there an opportunity to maybe invite somebody to say, like, hey, would you share with us, like, again, I don't want to be like weird, but fry bread making, or is there a way that we could do something like a native craft that we also tie to some of our own expressions of spirituality that are laden with theirs? And those are things I think we can explore. And what's great is you probably have more resources than I do. So it's always great to like tap into the community and think like, oh, like I know this person that does this thing, or one of my friends went to this thing that one of their friends invited them to, and maybe we could see about something like that. It doesn't always work. I mean, like way back about a year and a half ago, I was really hoping we could get a kintsugi workshop here, which is that Japanese way of mending pottery with gold. And I just couldn't find anybody to do it. And I even had somebody who very generously offered to help financially support it, but I couldn't find anybody to do it. So I still want to do it, and I just have to find somebody to do it. And I think that's one of these other bits is like, how do we find someone who can help us? Gracia, I saw your hand go up.
Well, I was just thinking, I do not know, I'm not familiar with Indian tribes that are close to us, Father Mike, and I'm just thinking, who would we consult with or work with that we could, have a connection? I'm just wondering about that. If there's any close by, groups close by.
Yeah, I'm hoping that when Darlene comes back on, Darlene has obviously a fair amount of experience with Native traditions, and that maybe Darlene could help us in point us in directions. And the other opportunity is Stephen Charleston is no longer the guy who looks over Native American spirituality in the Episcopal Church, but there is a post that exists. And so I can also ask them. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer here in the diocese called Denise Trevino. And that would be another really good opportunity for me to chase her and say like, hey, what do your contacts look like? So I'll do that. That seems really easy. We'd love to have one of these events. That'd be really fun. And you've heard me say before, I do have a friend here in the parish who has located for me a legitimate sweat lodge experience. And I was in a small group of people yesterday, and maybe we'll take a field trip. We have to go to Wimberley to do it, which is fine. And look, it's not for everybody, because it could be like, you have to consult your doctor before you do it, because it's like real hot. And I don't want to do it in the summer because I'm already real hot. But maybe like in November, we could take a parish field trip for like the 4 or 5 of us that want to do this and go to Wimberley and sit in the sweat lodge. I think that'd be actually pretty cool. It actually could correspond really well before Lent, right? Because the goal is like you go to the sweat lodge to like be prepared for a journey by like sweating out impurities. Okay, Lila.
Darlene just texted me that she's lost internet access.
been
Oh,
real spotty. So this is a good reason that we record these things so that people can hop back on. But of course, we'll be impoverished for not having Darlene. Yeah,
mhm.
Tim?
Yeah, I was just thinking, one thing we could do that doesn't really have anything to do with spirituality is there have been several senators and congressmen that have been trying to rescind the 20 Medal of Honor winners at the Battle of the Wounded Knee.
Mm.
And so, maybe we could, kind of write our congressman and say, please support that. Because there have been several attempts to do that. And there have been 900 the Medal of Honor winners that have been rescinded.
Huh. Well, that sounds interesting. Tim, do you have a link for that already?
I do somewhere. I'll
If you find it, Tim, I'd be really happy to distribute it, and then we'll see if we can't pick up some traction. Darlene, welcome back. I'm so glad your internet is working enough to
I
get.
was freaking out.
Yeah. Well, I was going to freak out too, but if it ever happens, if the meeting's running like it is right now, then ours works, and you can always just come join us up here.
Yeah. Across the
I'll
street.
get in my car, screech the wheels all the way.
Don't do that, but please do. Darlene, we were just talking about considering practices that we might engage in. Julia had asked about, she read a book to her kids called Fry Bread. And like, is there something we could do like that? We talked about potentially like picking out phrases that that meant something to us that could go on the prayer tree. But actually, I think it'd be really interesting to pick out a few things and create something called a peace poll. I don't know if you've heard about this, but instead of it saying just peace in a bunch of different languages, there are these sort of polls that could go around. I will say, and this is like on the expensive line, but when I used to live in Alaska, there was a Methodist pastor who had ended up making 2 totem poles, and he made them himself over a series of years out of cedar, and they're in a church, and they iconographically depict like the gospel story in the Yupik culture, and they're like amazing. They're super well done. They're gorgeous, and well, why not, right? Why not? We can always, I don't want to say we can always find that, but we can find that, and what I love about St. Thomas and the potential we have is that we embrace the arts here really well. And I believe that, in that sometimes we just need a connection, and then we can bring in that art and that story, and art also gives us a fantastic vision.
We could also do some stations at which there are smaller activities for individuals or kids or whoever to do. We can look through the books, the 2 books that I created with activities, and there's templates in there that we could use at the different stations. So those books are just full of activities for young kids and older kids. So
that would be fantastic. And that's what Julia has in mind. And I think it would be super, super duper cool to do something like that, because it expands the work of this small group and opens it up to the community. Because, this time isn't convenient for everybody. And sometimes reading a book is like not what people want to do. But even for us who have done it, to get our physical hands in is like really, really nice. Yeah.
great.
Okay, well, let's think about this in the background, and let's go forward, because we read chapters 3 and 4, and I don't know what your predilection is. Do you want to start with some targeted questions from the reading, or do you want to have some open time to just kind of think through what was meaningful for you?
Well, there were a couple things that struck me. It seems in the Native American culture, when they talk about the spirit or their God, there is no kind of separation like the Christianity has a separation between heaven and earth. there is no separation
Mhm.
in the Indian mind.
Yes.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yes.
I did get a laugh on page, let's see, what page was that? On page 48, whenever Red Jacket was asked to bring his Indian tribe into Christianity, and he said, well, we've got some Christians here and we'll observe them, and if they don't cheat us and if they don't take our land, we'll become Christian. I thought that's
That's wisdom, isn't it?
I got a big chuckle out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how, like, when you read that, it's like, boy, that's actually a pretty low bar. Sadly, that's a really high bar.
Well, I was impressed with a few things here too. Said that one of the fundamental differences, this is on 47, one of the fundamental differences between European and native cultures is how they understand trust and a spiritual value,
Mhm.
as a spiritual value. And white people want to see the data, read the fine print before they commit themselves to believe something. In other words, their motto is, I will believe it when I see it.
Yes.
On the other hand, Native Americans assume that only an experiential encounter with the holy can reveal the truth. They follow the motto, you will never see it if you don't believe it. And that's one of the things I found as we go through these chapters. You know, God is relational. In other words, we have been taught doctrine and all this other stuff, and we're in trouble with that today because people have not been taught how to have a relationship with God. And so this book really resonated with me because of that focus. So that was one of the things I got out of it.
Thank you.
That was a real balm to my heart, actually. And Mike, you've talked to us before about this idea that you kind of have to have an expectation of something before you'll even notice it
Yeah.
Mhm.
in your perception. And this idea of vision and vision quest it just resonates so strongly with me. And the word that I think we might more commonly use in our community, in our local community, is discernment.
Yes.
So one of the things he does mention is that we are often very reluctant to share our personal visions.
Mhm.
So our local communities we're just not accustomed to talking that way. So I think that's part of the importance of discernment and vision as you bring something back to your something transformational, not transcendent, back to your community.
Yeah.
So I thought I would just quickly share a vision I had
Please.
that is not very personal, but it was very dramatic. And it was when I was studying the forgive me, it's not Vein of Gold, it's the book that comes before that, The Artist's Way. And there's a discipline in The Artist's Way where you get up every morning and you write 3 pages. It doesn't matter what you write, you just write something.
Mhm.
And I think the idea is just kind of empty your head, and then you'll be in a meditative or contemplative place to listen. So I enjoy spending time in contemplation and listening and asking for help or asking for presence. So I was doing this, and I mean, I was writing grocery lists. I was saying, oh, I need to spray the garden. And I woke up about 20 days into it and very, very clearly heard, it was classic. I heard the voice because my first thought was, oh, write the pages. And the voice said, you have nothing to say. And I was like, yes, I have nothing to say. Boy, was that right. And it, you know, it sounds silly, but it had the elements that he talks about when he hears the voice saying, you have just read the first vision quest of Jesus. You need patience for these two paths, spiritual paths of yours to merge. It was very like that. It was definite, but simple, uncomplicated, clear,
Mhm.
discernment I'd been looking for. And I think we all have those experiences really quite often.
Mhm. I agree.
I think that they can, at the very least, bring clarity to ourselves personally, and maybe that just having some clarity is helpful to our community.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's
I do think that, you know, and Julia chimed in, like, she's been thinking, like, have any of you had a vision? And she was like, well, nothing immediately jumped to mind. And then she said, well, I'll take that back. You know, when we talked about preparing for the Rite of Reconciliation in February, she was like, I had really like a different understanding and vision of like what all of that might mean. And you know, I think like the word we tend to use instead of vision is probably epiphany, or like thin moment. And maybe like this is just a vocabulary change, or like making a synonym, you know, like I mentioned to you all in a sermon that I was in Carlsbad Caverns back in like, I don't know, October. And it was just stellar to me, the depth and intricacies of the cave. And like the vision was like the depth and intricacies of like my person. And that they're, you know, like how winding and how twisted and how like there's all this even uncharted territory inside. And that was a vision. You know, and you know, I don't have a new name after it, but like you could say like, oh, that was just a neat idea or an epiphany, or, but again, that's what a vision is. So being able to claim that terminology and then say, okay, then like, what's the fruit of that vision? That's how you complete a vision, right? Is that it bears fruit. And I think what he said that's really interesting about what transformation looks like is that in Jesus, the messenger becomes the message. And so that to me seems to be like the goal of the spiritual journey, is that we become the message ourselves.
Yeah, it says here that the truth claim of Native religion is not contained in a creed, but in behavior.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what we are called to is to become Christ-like, like Jesus. In other words, that's what transformation is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And that people who do that get the quote unquote holy halo. But the thing is this, it happens more often than we think to us, because, you know, we're not aware, because we haven't been taught that we can appreciate some things as visions and others as not. You know, this is like sort of a new language in some respect that
Mm-hmm.
I think we're hearing for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I really appreciate that, Meg, and I think chasing Julia, what Julia had said about the Rite of Reconciliation a little bit, it really stood out for me in chapter 3, where part of the goal of a vision is to rebalance our lives more so than like compensate for original sin. And
Mhm.
and that comes back to that study we did about the Rite of Reconciliation, that it is about like how we carry a load instead of like washing off a stain. And so I feel like there's been a lot of like dovetailing with what we've been talking about in small groups this year about, you know, what transformation looks like in terms of rebalancing a load or like correcting our posture. And those are the invitations of vision. So I thought that was really neat correspondence.
You know, when transformation takes place in a person, they walk with God consciously during the day. You know, and I think that in lots of ways, we've all been on a quest because we all seek God.
Mhm.
And so it is in a different form. But if we look back over life and see some of the trials and tribulations that we have been through, what we learned from them, how we recognize God's presence, how we made a firmer commitment to God, and begin to develop a relationship with God. There's some parallel there to me with the Native Americans. We just haven't thought of it that way.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have general thoughts or reflections from these two chapters? Or I'm more than happy for us to go backward.
Well, the other thing that I found interesting was how they connected to the earth. They had sacred spots, like it could be a rock or it could be a waterfall. That when they would go there, they would kind of make an offering or say a prayer or something. But there were places that they would consider holy, and that helped them to stay connected to the earth.
Mm.
They also appreciated the nature and the environment. They really did what God created humanity to do. They did take care of the environment. They didn't destroy it like we're very busily doing. I sometimes wonder, if we're even going to have an earth for when the second coming of Jesus comes.
Mm. Rhonda, thank you. Rhonda, I see I think I saw your hand ready to hop in.
Yeah, I really connected with this ghost dance or spirit dance
Mm-hmm.
that they're not explicitly saying it, and I find that many people don't explicitly say when they're trying to connect with people. To me, that is sharing the Holy Spirit. That this dance is embodying worship of God, and they're all in harmony doing it together. And to me, that just really shouts out sharing the Holy Spirit. And it's a terrible thing that the Wounded Knee thing happened while that's what they were focused on. And I just want to give you some context for me here in Colorado. And I'm a moderator at the United Church of Christ Church here. And I've been thinking about connecting with the Southern Ute Nation. It's a 2.5-hour drive from here. So I looked up their website, to see if we could give them a goat or something. And it turns out that they have a casino, and they have oil and gas companies, and they have a Montessori school, and they have a public museum that was designed by the same people who designed the Smithsonian Indian Museum. And I was thinking, well, maybe they don't need a goat. Maybe we can just go down there and see their museum and participate in watching their dances and going to their public events, and just not requiring anything from them, and just participate with them and say, we want to interact with you and share the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to have to look, into actually go down there and do some research and see if we can participate with them. But I really connected with the ghost or the spirit dance, and would love to see, just living like that in harmony with people worshiping together. I like that idea.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I put in the chat just for fun. This is the kind of thing like you sort of pick up along the way sometimes. There's only one Native American tuned hymn in our hymnal, hymn number 385. And I put a link to where you can hear it on YouTube. It's called Many and Great. And it actually is this really interesting story that there was a kangaroo court that happened in the Black Hills. And I think something like 25 Native Americans were to be hanged for like sedition. And this happened under President Abraham Lincoln. And the people were, from the Native perspective, they were absolutely innocent. And these 25 people sang this hymn at the gallows. It's like their hymn of protest. And it's in our hymnal. And it very much has like a Plains Native American beat to it. And if you look at the words of the hymn, again, it's very Native centric in like the text. And I just commend it to you. Sometimes we don't even realize the resources that we have. We've sung this hymn regularly here at St. Thomas at my request, even though it was new to us, and we don't always realize what we're singing. So I had a colleague who's in Sioux Falls, and she raised to me the greater context of this being a hymn of protest, and that's an interesting thing.
The name of it?
Many and Great.
Many and Great. Okay, thank you.
And you can just type that in YouTube, and you can listen to it sung, or you can open your hymnal to 385, and you'll find the text. Darlene, I perceive you were getting ready to hop in.
I think she's frozen.
She may be frozen, yeah. I want to share with Rhonda too, if I can follow up. I thought it was really fascinating that he said that dance is liturgy in the Native tradition, and that in some ways, like the ghost dance or the round dance is like the equivalent of having the Eucharist. And it made me think, like one of the ways I think we can be respectful of the Native American spirituality is to think through ways in which our liturgy can in fact become more inviting and communal. So I think we do this lovely thing where we use that Celtic prayer from Iona, inviting everybody to God's table every week. And one of the things I love about the Episcopal Church, honestly, like it's a reason I'm an Episcopalian, is that we have a common cup that we drink out of, which is really this true symbol of equality. I really, really love that. And that we all stand or kneel or do this bit together. But it occurs to me like maybe there's other opportunities for like, not tinkering, but like really living into the roundness of our own liturgy. And maybe there's ways we can better choreograph some of the things we already do to represent this sort of, again, this communal life. And I can tell you, for me, it's not going to be dancing, because that's not it. Like I'm always wary of people who love dancing, because that's just not me. But maybe there's some other ways we could creatively think through church tradition. And as you know, like I love doing that. So I don't want to call for those now unless you've got an idea. But again, I think this is a great idea to put on the back burner. Like, are there ways that we can think about some of our own liturgical traditions in ways that we can live into them in a more communal, round, full way, if that makes sense?
Well, one of the things I noticed here, it's on page 73, you mentioned the Eucharist. It says the scandal of the Eucharist is that it not only represents Jesus as God incarnate, but it allows human beings to touch God.
Yes.
Now, my understanding is that Episcopalians don't really believe in the true presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Am I correct about that?
No, we're absolutely follow Martin Luther in saying the Eucharist is the real presence.
Okay.
But what we say, right, is that transubstantiation is bogged down in essentially political mechanics. And what we'd rather do is open ourselves to the mystery of the real presence and say it has to be in these Aristotelian categories. This is why in the Episcopal Church, every church has a piscina in which you can pour surplus wine so it returns to the ground, because we don't disrespect the real presence by pouring it into the sewer.
Yeah, well, you share that with the Romans very well.
Yeah, but unlike the Romans, and this is what I appreciate, we actually invite more mystery at the Eucharist than the Roman Church. Usually the Roman Church excels at mystery, but by saying that we're not going to confine the real presence to physical qualities, we're going to say it's bigger than can be defined. I think we outdo our Roman colleagues there.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yes.
It's not a competition. What I appreciate is, look, even transubstantiation is limiting of what the real presence looks like, because it confines it to physical qualities, body and blood, instead of saying like, hey, that's just an idea of the real presence, but it's by no means the only idea. And that's kind of where we stand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I just brought that up because for my own, I needed the clarification, and since we're talking about doing something more, I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'll tell you, I really love the mutual confession we've been doing the last couple of weeks, because it's mutual. And I feel like hopefully that's congregational affirming, but for me, it's also this opportunity to receive in the community the same absolution that I get to give. It's nice to receive. And I don't think we'll do that all year, but I do think we'll do it all summer.
Good. Yeah.
I wonder if anybody has insight, thinking through the big claim in chapter 4, that Jesus essentially becomes a medicine man and not a war chief by becoming the message himself. And I wonder if you've had experiences in which you've heard a message, but also embodied that message, whether that's like religiously or theologically, or in the social justice realm, or maybe you know people that you would say like, boy, I know somebody who has become part of the vision instead of just casting it. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yes, I was talking to a friend yesterday. We've been friends for 50 years. She lives down in Bridge City. And some of the experiences that she was sharing with me about hearing God's voice. And there are times also when I have heard, but it doesn't, sometimes it comes across, it doesn't happen often. This is more of a rarity than a common thing. But the voice is different. It doesn't sound like a human voice necessarily, but because there's something beautiful and about it, and sort of like, it's sort of a distinctive. And I have to always be aware now, okay, now when I have thoughts, now, okay, that sounds like me, so I'm not going to pay any mind to that. But sometimes I do have good thoughts. And there are other times when God seems to speak through events, like the Alzheimer's house across the street. For a while there, it looked like I was going to volunteer there. And then they found out that there could not be any volunteers. So when I was walking back home across the street, because we just right opposite each other, I felt this feeling and these words in me saying, "You've done what you were sent to do." Okay, you know, just, and sometimes they're just little things like that. But you know, it's not a common everyday occurrence by any means. But I think the more we seek God, the key is not letting God seek us. It's we seek God and build this relationship with God. Then God at times honors us with, you know, these little ones, very short sentences of whatever God wants to say.
Tim?
Yes. You know, I don't think you need to always hear the voice of God, but say like if you're running, or say like when cross country, when you get in the zone, I think that's when you're close to God.
Mhm.
Cycling for me for years was an experience where I physically, and I don't want to sound hokey that I physically was close to God, but my gosh, when I went cross country over 3 months time, I never had a flat tire. I never had an accident, and I was really doing it by myself, and yet,
Wow.
but I carried the communion with me. I carried the host with me.
Wow.
Stayed with me all the time, under the pillow and my back pocket. I'll just say, when I got to upstate New York, I had to replace my back tire. And the guy who replaced it said, "You were playing your brakes on the mountains, weren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Your back tire is pretty raw." And yes, I had played my brakes on the mountains in the West. But anyway, I didn't have any blowouts. God didn't allow bad things to happen.
And I think when the Indians went into their dance, sometimes they got into kind of a zone.
Yes, and you know, the thing is this, the more you get with God, the more sensitive you become to God, then you find out that you're finding out little things that before they happen. And that's sometimes amazing. Well, I mean, it is amazing because when you think the thought goes through your head, and then you go someplace and they happen right in front of you. You just think, "Oh, well, okay, dear God, thank you."
I gotta go. Thank
Rhonda,
you.
we'll miss
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Boy, I hate Darlene's having internet trouble.
Yeah.
Lila, you're getting ready to respond.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you mean about this Jesus as the native medicine man becoming the message, and
Mhm.
have we seen that in our community?
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
not
great-
sure I understood what you said.
Yeah, so he spends time in chapter 4 talking about how a messianic expectation of the day of Jesus was looking more for a war chief. That's the word he uses. And to be honest, I think that's really fair to explain the disciples' confusion about, "Hey, Jesus, we thought you were going to lead an armed uprising against the Roman government." And I think if we're really, really fair, we get that's not the kind of Messiah Jesus ended up being, although I think most contemporary Christians still have that expectation that Jesus is going to help us transcend our reality. And here I'm using that word transcend instead of transform.
Yeah.
Again, onward Christian soldiers marching as to war.
Mhm.
So I think that kind of spirituality is very, very much embedded. And what I think he says is, instead of using the word wounded healer, which is the phrase Henri Nouwen came up with, right? I don't know if you know Henry Nouwen, the wounded healer. The Native American phrase is medicine man. And the medicine that Jesus offers, the balm in Gilead, you know, to use that African American language, is that the messenger becomes the message, and in so doing does not transcend, but transforms, right? And so I'll tell you, for example, I can come up with some ideas of folks who I think have figured this out. I'll just tell you a quick story. Once upon a time, in my last church, there was a couple who came to me kind of cold, and what they wanted to do is get married, and they wanted to get married in their own church, and not their parents' church. And this was intentional, right? So I was very happy to celebrate this wedding, and the parents were really gracious. They wanted to meet me as the celebrant for their kids, and they invited me over to dinner. And then came the actual wedding reception. And I will tell you, I've actually changed how I do this, but I don't go to wedding receptions anymore unless I really, really know the people, which is kind of ironic because I went to this one, and the father of the bride was the consummate host. He absolutely looked after me at that reception to make sure that I felt welcome and connected to his family. And the irony is, I was marrying his daughter so that she could have her own church, but her church became his because we made this tremendous connection through his hospitality. Again, the irony is I don't do this anymore, mainly because I don't want to exhaust people's goodwill when they're entertaining their family and friends, right? Like I don't want to be a load they have to carry. But in this instance, he embodied the message of inclusion and hospitality because he spent time with a stranger over his own family. And in that sense, he was the message. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying. And it was a conscious and clear choice. But I think he's one of those people, to get back to this idea, and I find it most often in like Buddhists, to be honest. He's not Buddhist, he's Christian, but he has this Buddhist aura about him of like hospitality and welcome, and you can almost feel it like in your skin, you know, and that kind of aura, for lack of a better word, right, is when the messenger becomes the message.
Yeah.
When you just exude this hospitality out of your pores, you know. Or I had a friend at a diocesan camp in San Diego. He grew up Mennonite, and he didn't do this as an axe to grind, but he would take camp songs that kids like to sing, and maybe you're familiar with the song Pharaoh, Pharaoh. It's a play off this old 70s song, Louie, Louie, right? And there's a line in the song that goes, okay, so if you don't know it, it goes like, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go free. Huh! All right, so like kids sing this song, and there's a line in it that all of Pharaoh's army did the dead man's float. And Laban very naturally changed the libretto to all of Pharaoh's army learn from their mistakes. And he wasn't doing it like to grind an axe. He was doing it because he embodied that message. And he did it with the campers, like, you made a mistake and you get to learn from it. And in that way, the messenger became the message. Erik Erikson calls this word integrity. And he basically says that adults don't enter into this phase of life until they're like 70. But I do think it's like the quest of the spiritual journey or the vision. I mean, when we use the word integrity in Erickson speak, we're talking about the messenger becoming the message.
And that's what Christians are called to be. They are called to become the message.
I think what I love about Stephen Charleston here is that that's what humans are called to be.
Yeah. Well, the reason I differentiated Christians is because you don't see a lot of them doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I very much liked his inclusiveness about all religions. I think that is the way we should all be. You don't have to believe the way they do. Just respect their right to believe as they want to, and love them anyway.
Does this bring up to you anything else, like in your mind, about people you've met who have become the message? Or again, I think the invitation is, we in the Western, we like to use the word epiphany instead of vision, but would you speak to an epiphany or to a vision you've had, and on the flip side of the vision, you've become that component of the message?
Mike, I find my experience of you is you are a message of inclusion and acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's very kind of you. Now, I don't want to dig. I'm not digging, but would you say more about how the message becomes embodied?
You're open-hearted. You are welcoming. You are curious about other people's thoughts and opinions and ways, and you're willing to entertain a different idea, like our Day of the Dead service. How fun is that? And liberating, and a new, it's like a new kind of slice of ritual that embodies a loveliness of worship. And you bring things like that. The wonderful Iona prayers. Your willingness to say yes to anyone that comes needing a wedding or a funeral. How precious is that? Loving without judgment.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that? It's, whenever we see you and you have tattoos and you have an earring, but that has made you who you are today. And so as we embrace you and we see the differences, we accept the differences because they make people who they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.
And I think that the image you put before us, the modeling you give us, is like the vision quest. You come back and you're not only transformed, but you're instrumental in transforming those around you.
That's really kind. I hope it's okay to say too that I have this vision of inclusivity that seems really important. And I don't even always know how to do it. So I think like I still am struggling. Struggling is maybe not the right word. I'm still growing into like what the vision really means, like how radical inclusivity is meant to be. And there's something really cool about being able to voice the vision and having done that. Like, I don't get to stop growing. I find myself backed into corners where I'm like, oh man, now I really get to grow into my own words here.
What do I do now?
Yeah, well, and I get the answers like, well, I go forward. And, you know, like this is a great thing about my life partner. I recently was sharing with her at home how like I'm still trying to figure out they, them as like reference, right? So he, his, and she, her, no problem. And if somebody flips those, no problem. But like they, them. And so my non-parochial life partner continues to send me NPR articles and Facebook articles that like talk about this as she notices them, to say like, well, that's real sweet. And like, here you go, here's the fertilizer you need so you can grow into that. And I think it's with the assumption and conviction that those are going to be heard and listened to and embraced. And that's where I think, coming back to like, there's this idea, like when you air a vision, the community actually supports even the visionary and becoming it. And that's where the liturgy becomes round, right? It's like, hey, you said this, and it got me thinking that you can do this even more. And here are some resources for you. And if you'll grow into it, we will too.
Yes.
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 I'll tell you about two. You've heard me say this before, but I've got two visionaries here who I really respect, particularly as men, because they're very careful with their speech. And so I happen to know two guys that are really thoughtful, great leaders, and they're really funny, but I've never heard them make a joke at someone else's expense. And as a personnel like middle manager, one of them told me that, hey, you never give an employee feedback unless it's going to be constructive, even if you're going to dismiss them. So if you're going to dismiss somebody, you just do that. And if you don't have any constructive feedback, then you just dismiss them. And Herb Meyer and Rob Puckett, this is who they are. And I don't know that they would say like, oh, that's a vision of the gospel, but for me, that's a vision of the gospel. Like that's what they do. They are those people. And the fact that you can absolutely trust them because they don't talk about anybody negatively ever, which means they're not going to do that about you to anybody else, is transformative. And if you don't know these guys, you should get to know them. Lila, I appreciate your comment in the chat. Lila said, instead of a load we have to carry, can you be a joy we can embrace? And I think that's really fair. And I like the positive framing, although I want to come back to something that I read a couple of weeks ago, right? That we read in Sisters of the Wilderness, that sometimes joy is an act of resistance. And so sometimes maybe joy is, I'm resisting carrying that burden that you think I'm supposed to carry. And that does take energy. So I don't think the spiritual life is about how do I exercise no energy. I think the question is like, how do we find a flow, right? And flow sometimes takes practice. In fact, it always takes practice. Even if you're doing something just very physical, right? Like it takes practice in order to get to flow. And you can call that work or you can call that discipline. And it only really becomes joyous, in my experience, when you can enter into the flow state. And in general, that takes time. The flow state is very rarely there the first time. What else do we have from the book? Or, actually, I think this is a great part based on what you've read so far. If you could ask Stephen Charleston a question, like what would you ask him?
I've got, yes. Whenever you read what Red Jacket says,
Yeah.
How could the Native Americans embrace Christianity when they saw what Christians would do? It's kind of like when Mahatma Gandhi said, I really could become a Christian, but I don't see any.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that he actually said that. I think that's falsely attributed. For what it's worth, he was close to converting in England when he was at Oxford. And I think like the pithy version of that quote is, I like their Christ, I don't like their Christians. Not sure that he actually said that either, but it's fine. Ultimately, what Gandhi ended up saying is the way that he could be the best Christian is to be the best Hindu.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is something really cool that Stephen Charleston does, right? Is he says, I'm not going to be a bi-spiritual person. I'm not going to be a Native American and a Christian. Like, I'm looking for integrity. And Red Jacket, I think, and I put that quote from Red Jacket you sent me in the chat, by the way, it's long, but he basically, I think he's kind of saying the same thing, which is, hey, look, if we really believe there's one God, which is the Native belief, and you say that's the Christian belief, right? Then what's the problem here?
Yeah.
And I think the problem comes back to the understanding of Jesus as, frankly, a war chief who's interested in his tribe prevailing instead of a medicine man who's interested in serving all of the different sovereign nations. And we haven't figured that out in some ways because the legacy of the Reformation is you have to hold these intellectual tenets. And I think the reason we fixate on those is because mystery is so hard.
Yeah.
It's like so hard to hold on that let's just go back to the tenets. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that probably the single event that changed Christianity the most was the Nicene Creed, because before that, there was a ton of diversity in Christianity. And the emperor found that intolerable because guess what, as an emperor, like you don't want heterogeneity, you want homogeneity. I mean, that's what Constantine decided and presided over. And he endorsed a creed he didn't even believe in because he was an Arian. He believed Jesus was a created being, but he was willing to accept this co-eternal language for the sake of uniformity. And this, I think, is Andy Doyle's vision, is like, hey, we are striving for unity in mission, not uniformity in doctrine. And I think Red Jacket would say something really similar. We're striving for unity of humanity in mission, whether that's creation care or kinship, not uniformity in our liturgy or in our doctrines. And it's like, I think this experiment, Tim, where like, I don't really know what happens when a church says like, you're going to believe what you want anyway, so why don't we just celebrate that? Here's the language that, you know, we tend to use traditionally. So let's see if that language is meaningful for you. But man, wherever you are, there's value and there's God there. So maybe we can draw that out of you and learn. I think it's hard as a parent, right? Because you want to form your kids in some kind of basis so that they've got something they can build off of. And in some ways we can do that in a competitive way, sadly, that becomes indoctrination. But I don't know that we have to do that, right? And so like, I even see this between churches. It's sort of like, well, St. Christopher's is really close to us and we don't want to do too much with them because we might lose members to over there. And this is why churches don't work together, which is kind of nuts, right? Because at the end of the day, we have very different buildings and different ethoses, and we both have the name Episcopal. So why on earth would we not work together when we can? We don't need to fuse and become the same building. Like, you know, look, there's a reason we have two different congregations that are relatively close apart, because there's people who want to be served in those areas and in those histories and traditions. But I think it just comes back to like, what are we really afraid of in partnership? That we're going to lose members? Maybe we're just afraid of the wrong thing, or maybe we should be more afraid of different things than that. I know that example came out of nowhere, but it really does come out of somewhere, right? I mean, we've got 4 churches in Nassau Bay and we don't do anything together. And there's some reasons for that, which they just are. And in other ways, they're also very sad. I don't see that changing. I don't. Kind of sadly. But I don't think that's something that we give up on. Maybe that's just something we lay aside because it's not feasible yet, but hopefully it will be in the future.
But you know, it's not just Episcopalians that have that problem. I don't know of any church of any denomination that really works together. I imagine by the law of averages, there might be a few, but in general, no.
Yeah, I mean, even in the Roman churches around, right? There's people who are like, oh, I live in this neighborhood, but I'm not going to St. Paul's because they're too blah, blah. So I go to St. Mary's or I go to St. B's, and then something happens at one of those places and then they shuffle again. I mean, this is just how we live. It is. Yeah. And I'm real sensitive to it because look, you know, a lot of what we do is clergy centric, and that's not going to change. So if you don't like the clergy, it's pretty easy to drive somewhere else. I'm not sure that's terribly bad. I mean, I just think that is, but I think the question is like, well, what is there beyond the cleric? What's there beyond the cleric, and how can we work with or in spite of the cleric as a larger community?
Well, coming from a situation where there was no way of doing that.
Well, and I think that's something that you get sensitive to, right? There's this question like, hey, one of the things that's frustrating me is that there is no permeability here. And then that creates a crisis, right? And in the old model, some people say, well, this is my church and I'm going to outlast the priest and I'll make it hell for her the whole time she's here. I mean, that's the old attitude, and I have some respect for it. But after a while, that becomes so like spiritually depleting that folks either stop going or they move on, right? And these are real life situations and they're really tough and there's no easy answer to them, right? I mean, do you continue like to go to your church to give hell to the cleric? That seems like a really like misguided spirituality. It is. And that's where this is really, really difficult. I might have taken us on a rabbit trail we didn't want to go on. So let me retreat and offer you last words and phrases about these couple chapters.
Yeah, because I'm going to have to go to the dentist.
Yeah.
The kind of interesting thing to me is all the vision quest that the Native Americans had. Some of that was for war. And so, you know, I think as we look at Native American spirituality, their culture and their way of life was much different. Well, maybe perhaps not when you look at the Europeans, but you know, their hunting, their war parties were part of their spirituality.
Yeah, I do think that's an interesting thought, Tim, is that sometimes I think and I get why it's really, really difficult systemically, especially, but sometimes I think we kind of compartmentalize our spirituality away from things like our shopping practices and our eating practices. And it's really interesting to think like, well, this is again part of the integrity that Erik Erikson talks about, right? Like, does my theology inform my shopping? And if it doesn't, right, then the real question is like, what would it take for you to get to that level of integrity? Because integrity means, right, everything is integrated.
I'm not sure this applies, but as having been raised as a Roman Catholic, and during the period when Lent was, and I mean, Lent still exists, but there was a period as I was growing up that the 40 days, the 40 days of Lent were really for each one of us. I guess I'll speak for myself. I hate to say the word, I made promises, but I started on certain decisions, whatever it might be, about eating, or about the time I was a smoker. This was a long time ago, but certain things, or saying the rosary, and whatever it was, it was so important to me to maintain that whatever practice it was that I determined would be my Lenten journey. Mm-hmm. And I lost, and I don't know why, Father Mike, why I sort of lost some of that, so that I don't have that kind of commitment, really. And maybe I do it in some other ways, I'm not real sure. Mm-hmm. But that feels so different. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I can tell you in my own spiritual journey, when I grew up, there was things I had to do. And as I've grown up, I realized I don't have to do those things. And sadly, sometimes, since I don't have to, I don't do them anymore. Instead of, I don't have to do this, but I get to.
Yes. Yeah.
So the people I'm most interested in, frankly, like spiritually, are ones who have like liberated like politics and theology, but also have like strong piety practices. Because I grew up with strong piety practices that weren't tied to liberation. And as I've grown up, I've sometimes like, well, that was no good. And I often find myself jettisoning disciplines instead of reforming them. Mm. All right. Well, thank you, friends. I'm really looking forward to hearing more what we think about how we can do some exercises as we think through this, and ways that we can kind of be more playful with our own liturgy here so that they can include this communal element. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what we think of the first two visions of Jesus that we're going to read next week. So I will see you then, and thank you for walking this road together.
You're welcome.